Most people remember Jonathan Antoine as the shy teenager who won Britain's Got Talent. But what they don't know is that his life completely fell apart right after his greatest moment. He disappeared from public view for years. His voice, the one that made millions cry, became silent. No albums, no tours, no explanations. Then came the shocking revelation that would change everything about how we see him. This is the real story nobody talks about. Jonathan Antoine was 14 years old when he walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage in 2012. He wasn't like the other contestants. While dancers flipped and comedians made jokes, Jonathan stood there in his school uniform, nervous, almost trembling. His partner Carlton West stood beside him. They were just two teenagers with a dream. Then they opened their mouths and sang. The moment his voice hit the first note, something shifted in that theater. The audience went completely silent. Simon Cowell leaned forward. Amanda Holden's eyes widened. It wasn't just that he could sing, it was that his voice carried something raw and real. A 14-year-old kid was singing like a professional opera singer. He was singing like his life depended on it. Week after week, Jonathan and Carlton won over the entire nation. They weren't just competitors anymore. They were the story everyone was talking about. A shy boy from East London with an extraordinary gift. The underdog. The one nobody expected to make it. When they won the competition in May 2012, over 13 million people watched it happen. Millions more celebrated with them online. Record deals came instantly. Management companies wanted to sign them. The music industry was suddenly interested. Jonathan Antoine wasn't just famous. He was the voice of his generation. Everyone wanted to know him. Everyone wanted to hear more. But here's what the cameras didn't show. Jonathan was struggling. Behind every perfect performance was anxiety, so intense he could barely function. The spotlight that everyone else dreamed of felt like a trap to him. He was still just a teenager dealing with normal teenage problems, except his problems were happening in front of millions of people. The pressure was building, and nobody around him seemed to notice. After winning BGT, Jonathan and Carlton's lives transformed in ways they never expected. They released their debut album in 2012, and it shot straight to #2 on the UK charts. They were touring, performing, signing autographs. Every door was opening. On paper, it looked perfect, but Jonathan was drowning. The anxiety that had always been there was getting worse. Much worse. He couldn't sleep properly. He couldn't eat. Before performances, he'd feel his heart racing uncontrollably. His hands would shake. He'd have panic attacks backstage while thousands of people waited to hear him sing. Nobody knew because he was professional enough to step out and deliver. He always delivered. That was the torture of it. Nobody could see what was happening inside. In 2014, just 2 years after his BGT win, Jonathan made a decision that shocked everyone. He stepped away from music. He stopped performing with Carlton. He canceled appearances. He disappeared from social media. The golden boy vanished. The media didn't understand. Fans were confused. People started asking questions. Was he sick? Was there drama between him and Carlton? Why would someone throw away everything he'd worked for? The entertainment industry moved on quickly. New talents emerged. New stories replaced his story. Jonathan Antoine became yesterday's news. What nobody realized was that stepping away wasn't giving up. It was survival. The pressure had become so intense that continuing would have destroyed him completely. He needed to stop. He needed to breathe. He needed to figure out who he actually was beneath all the fame and expectation. For 5 years, Jonathan lived a life nobody saw. He wasn't performing. He wasn't in the tabloids. He wasn't trending on social media. He was just a young man trying to heal from something that had nearly broken him. The real story, the one that would later shock everyone, was happening entirely in private. During those 5 years of silence, Jonathan Antoine was fighting a battle that nobody knew about. He wasn't just dealing with anxiety anymore. The pressure, the isolation, and the constant scrutiny had triggered something deeper. He struggled with depression. Some days, getting out of bed felt impossible. The voice that had once filled theaters with emotion couldn't even speak to friends without overwhelming fear. What made it worse was the shame. He felt like he'd failed. He'd been given this incredible opportunity, something millions of people would kill for. and he couldn't handle it. Instead of feeling grateful, he felt broken. That contradiction twisted inside him every single day. How could someone with such a gift be so damaged? How could he throw it all away? Jonathan isolated himself. He stopped going out. He stopped answering calls from people in the music industry. He watched from a distance as other young talents rose and fell. He saw new BGT winners get their moment. He wondered if anyone even remembered him anymore. Part of him hoped they didn't. Being forgotten felt safer than being remembered as a failure. During this time, something important happened. Jonathan started talking to people who actually understood. He found therapists who could help him work through the trauma of sudden fame. He connected with other young performers who'd experienced similar breakdowns. And slowly, incredibly slowly, he started to heal. He realized that his anxiety wasn't a personal flaw. It was a real condition that millions of people experience. He wasn't weak for struggling. He wasn't ungrateful for stepping away. He was human, and humans have limits. But there was something else happening during those quiet years, something that would eventually lead to his return. Jonathan was rediscovering music on his own terms. Not for audiences, not for record labels, not for anyone but himself. He was learning to sing again, not as a performer desperate to please, but as a person who simply loved to create. This quiet revolution would change everything. But before Jonathan could fully heal, something happened that forced everything into the open. In 2017, 5 years after he'd stepped away, Jonathan made headlines again, but not for his voice. He was arrested. The charges were serious. Drug possession. The details shocked the people who still remembered him. For many fans, it confirmed their worst fears. They thought he'd become another cautionary tale. Another child star destroyed by fame. Another young person who couldn't handle success and turned to substances to cope. The narrative was already written. The story was already over. Jonathan Antoine had hit rock bottom, but this moment, as dark as it was, actually became a turning point. Being arrested forced Jonathan to confront everything he'd been avoiding. He couldn't hide anymore. He couldn't pretend things were okay. He was forced into a system that demanded he get real help. And this time, he did. He went through rehabilitation. He worked with addiction specialists. He started talking about his mental health publicly for the first time. What emerged from this crisis was honesty. Raw, uncomfortable honesty. Jonathan stopped performing the role of the golden boy. He stopped pretending that winning BGT had been some perfect fairy tale. He started telling the truth about what really happened, about the pressure, the anxiety, the depression, the desperation. This was dangerous territory. He could have been completely canceled. He could have been permanently erased from the public consciousness. But instead, something unexpected happened. People responded to his honesty. Mental health conversations were starting to shift in 2017 and 2018. People were beginning to understand that fame could be traumatic, that young performers needed protection, that success didn't automatically equal happiness. Jonathan's story suddenly became relevant again, but in a completely different way. He wasn't the talented kid anymore. He was the cautionary tale turned redemption story. He was proof that you could hit absolute rock bottom and still climb back out. The real drama wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. The period from 2017 to 2022 became Jonathan's actual recovery. This wasn't quick. This wasn't some Hollywood montage where everything gets better in 90 seconds. This was brutal, unglamorous, day-by-day work. He entered rehabilitation and stayed committed to his healing. He worked with therapists who specialized in trauma from early fame. He learned coping mechanisms for anxiety and depression. He had good days and bad days. Sometimes he'd go weeks feeling genuinely better, then crash hard. Recovery isn't linear. It's messy and complicated and exhausting. During this time, Jonathan also had to rebuild his entire identity. The person he'd been at 14, the BGT winner, wasn't who he was anymore. But he wasn't sure who he actually was either. He'd spent so much of his formative years performing that he'd never really gotten to figure out Jonathan Antoine the person, not Jonathan Antoine the voice. He started small. He went back to school. He took time to do normal things that regular young people do. He worked jobs that had nothing to do with entertainment. He made friends who didn't know about his past. He lived a quiet life in London, rebuilding from the ground up. Nobody was watching. Nobody was documenting his comeback. It was just him doing the work, one day at a time. But something remarkable was happening beneath the surface. Jonathan was finding genuine peace for the first time since he was 14 years old. Not the peace of achievement or awards or applause. The kind of peace that comes from simply accepting who you are, flaws and all. Around 2021 and 2022, Jonathan started thinking about music again. Not because he had to, not because anyone was pressuring him, but because he genuinely wanted to. He began recording in private. He started posting videos on social media. Just him, his voice, no production, no pressure. And people started noticing. His real fans never forgot him. And new people discovered him through these raw, honest recordings. The world was about to remember Jonathan Antoine. But this time, on completely different terms. In 2022, Jonathan Antoine did something that shocked everyone who'd been following his story. He sat down for an honest interview and told the complete truth about everything that had happened. Not the sanitized version. Not the version that protected anyone's feelings. The real story. He talked about the pressure of BGT. How winning at 14 had felt like both the greatest blessing and the worst curse simultaneously. He explained how the entertainment industry had pushed him to keep performing despite his obvious mental health crisis. How people around him had prioritized his commercial value over his well-being. How he'd been a child in an adult's industry with nobody truly protecting him. He was brutally honest about his drug use. He didn't minimize it or make excuses. He explained how he'd turned to substances as a way to numb the anxiety and depression that had become unbearable. He talked about the shame, the guilt, the feeling of being a disappointment to everyone who'd believed in him. He described what rock bottom actually felt like, not as some abstract concept, but as a real place where he genuinely wondered if life was worth living. But here's what made his revelation powerful. He didn't stop at the darkness. He also talked about recovery, not as some miraculous overnight transformation, but as a genuine, messy, difficult process. He talked about therapy, about medication, about learning to accept his mental illness instead of fighting it, about discovering that his anxiety and depression didn't define him. They were just part of his human experience. Jonathan revealed something else that changed how people saw him. He talked about his sexuality. He came out publicly, explaining that hiding this part of himself had added another layer of pressure and shame during his teenage years. Being a famous teenager in the early 2010s, still closeted, still terrified, it had compounded his mental health struggles in ways he'd never fully processed until much later. When he finally spoke his truth, the response was overwhelming. Not judgment, not dismissal, but recognition. Thousands of people reached out saying his story had helped them. Young performers talked about how his honesty had made them feel less alone. Mental health advocates praised him for speaking openly about his struggles. Jonathan Antoine had accidentally become a voice for something far more important than winning a talent show. After years of silence and struggle, Jonathan's return to music wasn't about recapturing his BGT glory. It was about something completely different, reclaiming his voice on his own terms. In 2022 and 2023, Jonathan started performing again. But these weren't the polished, high-pressure performances of his past. He performed at smaller venues. He did intimate concerts where he could connect directly with audiences. He posted acoustic covers online. He was rebuilding his relationship with music from scratch, this time without the crushing weight of expectation. What surprised people was how good he sounded. Better, actually, his voice had matured. It carried weight now, not just technical perfection but genuine emotion. When Jonathan sang, you could hear everything he'd been through. The pain was there. The healing was there. The survival was there. It made his performances infinitely more powerful than they'd ever been as a teenager. He also started collaborating with other artists and using his platform differently. Instead of chasing chart success, he started advocating for mental health awareness. He spoke at schools about the dangers of early fame. He worked with organizations that support young performers. He became mentorship for other BGT contestants who were struggling with the pressure of sudden success. Jonathan also reconnected with Carlton West, his original BGT partner. Their relationship had been strained during the difficult years, but they worked through it. They started performing together again. not because they had to, but because they genuinely wanted to. Their reunion performances were emotional and authentic in ways their original BGT performances could never have been. These two young men had survived something together and come out the other side. That shared survival meant everything. The transformation was real, but quiet. Jonathan wasn't chasing headlines anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was simply living, making music because he loved it, helping others because he understood their pain, building a life that actually felt sustainable and genuine. By 2023 and 2024, Jonathan had become something unexpected. Not a comeback kid trying to recapture past glory, but a genuinely healthy young man who'd survived his own story and emerged transformed. Today, Jonathan Antoine is living a life that would have seemed impossible during those dark years of silence and struggle. He's in his late 20s now, no longer the nervous 14-year-old who won BGT, but a fully formed adult who's earned his peace the hard way. He continues to perform, but strategically. He does select concerts and appearances. He's released music independently, maintaining creative control and refusing to sacrifice his mental health for commercial success. He's learned to say no. He's learned to set boundaries. These might sound like simple things, but for someone who spent years trying to please everyone, they were revolutionary. Jonathan is also deeply involved in mental health advocacy. He speaks openly about his experiences with anxiety, depression, and addiction. He's become a voice for young performers navigating the treacherous waters of early fame. His story has helped countless people recognize that mental health struggles aren't character flaws. They're genuine medical conditions that deserve proper treatment and compassion. He's maintained his connection to music education as well. He mentors young singers and performers, helping them understand that talent alone isn't enough. You need support systems, boundaries, and genuine care for your mental well-being. He's the kind of mentor he desperately needed when he was 14. Perhaps most importantly, Jonathan has rebuilt his relationship with himself. He's learned to separate his worth from his achievements. He knows that he's valuable whether he's performing sold-out concerts or living a completely private life. That fundamental shift in perspective is what allowed him to actually survive and thrive. The real story of Jonathan Antoine isn't about a talented kid who won a competition. It's about a human being who was nearly destroyed by the machinery of fame, hit rock bottom, and found the courage to rebuild himself from scratch. It's about the invisible battles that happen behind closed doors. It's about how silence and shame can almost kill you, but honesty and help can save you. His journey reminds us that success isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about surviving. Sometimes it's about choosing your own well-being over everyone else's expectations. Sometimes the real victory is simply still being here, still fighting, still choosing to live authentically. Jonathan Antoine's story isn't finished, but this chapter, the chapter where he finally found himself, is the one that matters most.